The alarm in the chamber was not loud, but it was worse than loud. It was quiet, precise, and final, the kind of sound our systems only made when something had broken that was never supposed to break. I was standing at my station, halfway through reviewing a routine trade dispute between two mining worlds, when the notification appeared on every screen in the room at once. The human reply had arrived. I remember the exact words, because I read them so many times afterward that they burned themselves into my memory. "We'll get back to you." That was all. No formal greeting. No acknowledgement of the 700 pages of treaty language my colleagues had spent 3 years preparing. No mention of tribute schedules, border agreements, technology exchange terms, or the ceremonial gifts we had sent along with the proposal as a gesture of good faith. 5 words, in response to the most important diplomatic package the Council had produced in a generation. I looked around the chamber and saw the same expression on every face, human or not, that I imagine was on mine. Confusion first, then a kind of nervous laughter from a few of the junior aides, the sort of laughter people use when they are trying to convince themselves something is not as strange as it feels. High Speaker Orena Doss stood at the center podium, her 4 eyes fixed on the projection of the message, as if staring at it long enough might reveal a hidden clause we had somehow missed. She was the oldest member of the council I had ever served under, a diplomat who had personally negotiated the entry terms for 11 different species. I had watched her handle war criminals, planet-cracking industrial disputes, and one memorable incident involving a religious schism that nearly ended in orbital conflict. I had never seen her look confused before that day. I want you to understand something about the Council before I go further, because without it, none of what happened will make sense. Every species that has ever joined this body did so through negotiation. Long negotiation. Some took decades. The Threlvanes spent almost a full century arguing over shipping lane access before they signed anything. The Kethri insisted on 40 separate ceremonial exchanges before their representatives would even sit in the same room as ours. Diplomacy, to us, was not simply a tool. It was the foundation everything else was built on. Peace, trade, technology sharing, mutual defense, all of it existed because species agreed to sit down, argue, compromise, and eventually sign something binding. We did not know how to exist any other way. So when the humans sent us 5 words instead of a counter-proposal, the Council did not know what to do with itself. I watched Orena Doss turn to her advisors and ask, quite seriously, whether this could be a translation error. Whether the phrase "we'll get back to you" carried some deeper meaning in human linguistic structure that our translation systems had failed to capture. I remember one of the linguists, a nervous young Threlvane named Dessa, spending nearly 6 hours cross-referencing human idiom before reporting back that no, it meant exactly what it appeared to mean. The humans were simply going to think about it and respond later, on their own schedule, without any obligation to explain their timeline to anyone. I did not believe her at first. None of us did. I had been assigned to the human contact team 8 months earlier, back when first contact protocols were still being drafted. My role was modest, mostly translation review and cultural analysis, but I had read everything available on humanity by that point. Their history was violent in places, brilliant in others, marked by contradictions that made them difficult to summarize in the tidy briefing documents the Council preferred. They had fought among themselves for most of their recorded history, and yet had also produced extraordinary cooperation when circumstances demanded it. They built things quickly, they changed their minds often, and they seemed to possess an unusual comfort with uncertainty that none of our existing behavioral models accounted for. Even so, I assumed the delay was strategy. Every species that had ever approached the negotiating table understood the value of appearing unhurried. Show too much eagerness, and you lose leverage. I had seen this tactic before, from smaller factions trying to punch above their actual bargaining weight. I assumed humanity, new to galactic politics and eager to establish itself as a serious power, was doing the same thing, playing hard to get, as one of my human language texts described it. I told my colleagues this in a private meeting later that week, and most of them agreed. It made sense. It fit the pattern. We were wrong, though it would take weeks for that wrongness to fully reveal itself. The days that followed were strange in a way I find difficult to describe even now. The council convened daily to discuss the human situation, and each day brought no new information, only more speculation. Orena Das ordered a full review of every prior communication with Earth, searching for any clue we might have missed. Nothing turned up. The humans had been perfectly polite throughout the initial contact process. Their scientists had been curious and cooperative during the early technical exchanges. Their government representatives had attended every scheduled meeting on time, dressed appropriately, and asked intelligent questions about council structure and history. And then, once the formal treaty package was delivered, they had simply gone quiet. I want to be honest about how the council felt during this period, because panic is not too strong a word, even though it took time to fully surface. At first there was only mild unease, the kind of low-grade anxiety that comes from an unfamiliar delay in an otherwise predictable process. But as 1 week became 2, and 2 became 4, that unease began to sharpen into something closer to fear. Because here is the thing about the council that most outsiders never fully grasp. Our entire structure depends on universal participation. Every species with warp-capable travel is expected to eventually join, sign the founding treaties, accept the shared defense obligations, and submit to council arbitration in matters of dispute. This is not framed as a choice, not really. It is framed as an inevitability, the natural next step for any civilization mature enough to reach beyond its home system. Species that resist this process are typically small, isolated, or lacking the resources to meaningfully refuse for long. Eventually, through a combination of economic incentive, diplomatic pressure, and occasionally more direct persuasion, they come around. Humanity was not small, humanity was not isolated, and humanity, as it turned out, was not particularly interested in coming around. I remember the exact meeting where the mood in the chamber shifted from confusion to something darker. It was during the 6th week of silence, and Orena Das had called an emergency session after receiving reports that human trade vessels were continuing to operate in contested systems without submitting the customary transit requests. Not aggressively, not in violation of any physical safety protocol. They simply were not asking permission, the way every other species did, the way every other species had always done. A representative from the Threlvane delegation stood and asked the question that, I think, had been sitting unspoken in every mind in that chamber for weeks. What happens if they never respond at all? Nobody had an answer, and in a body built entirely around consensus, the absence of an answer was, in its own quiet way, the most frightening thing any of us had experienced in a very long time. The Threlvane representative who asked that question, a thin, careful diplomat named Valo Bryn, did not receive an answer that day. Instead, Orena Das called for immediate action. If humanity would not come to us, she said, then the council would go to humanity. A new delegation would be assembled, larger and more senior than the first, carrying not just a revised treaty but a formal request for clarification on the delay itself. I was added to this second delegation as a junior translator, which meant I had a front-row seat to what I now think of as the Council's long and painful education in humility. The delegation arrived at the human diplomatic station orbiting Earth with considerable ceremony. Ambassador Gralin Tesk led the group, a seasoned negotiator who had once talked 2 rival factions out of a resource conflict that had lasted 3 generations. He believed, as most of us did, that the humans simply needed a clearer picture of what was expected of them. He believed that once the stakes were properly explained, in terms humans could not misunderstand, the silence would end. We were greeted at the station by a mid-level diplomatic officer named Daniel Hart. I remember him clearly because he was younger than I expected, with an easy manner that seemed almost disrespectful given the seniority of our delegation. He shook hands with Ambassador Tesk, offered us refreshments, and asked genuinely curious questions about our home system's climate before the formal meeting even began. It was warm, welcoming, and completely unlike any diplomatic reception I had witnessed before. Then the meeting started, and everything about that warmth disappeared into something far stranger. Ambassador Tesk opened with the traditional council address, a formal recitation of shared obligations that every species had heard during their own entry negotiations. It usually took about 20 minutes to deliver in full, and most species listened with the appropriate solemnity, understanding it as the ceremonial gateway into serious discussion. Daniel Hart listened for about 4 minutes before he checked the time on a small device on his wrist. I watched Ambassador Tesk falter, just slightly, in his delivery. It was such a small thing, but I had never seen a diplomat of his standing lose the thread of a formal address before. He recovered quickly and continued, but something in the room had shifted. When he finished, he asked, with as much patience as he could summon, whether the human government required additional time to review the treaty terms, or whether there were specific clauses causing concern that the council delegation could address directly. Daniel Hart's response was polite. It was even friendly. And it was, in its own way, devastating. He said that the treaty had been reviewed. He said that several people were still discussing it. He said that Earth did not currently have a unified answer to give, because different groups on the planet had different priorities, and reaching agreement among themselves would take some additional time. When Ambassador Tesk asked how much additional time, Daniel Hart shrugged, in front of the entire delegation, and said he honestly did not know. I remember the silence that followed. It was not the tense, calculated silence of a negotiation, the kind both sides use as leverage. It was something else entirely. It was the silence of people who had just realized they were operating from two completely different playbooks. Over the following months, the Council tried nearly everything within its established protocols. Senior delegations were sent, each larger and more decorated than the last. Ancient diplomatic customs were invoked, rituals so old that most species had stopped practicing them generations ago, brought back specifically because they were believed to carry weight that modern negotiation had lost. One delegation arrived with a formal offer of technology sharing so generous that 3 separate council factions objected, worried it would set a dangerous precedent for future negotiations with other species. None of it produced the result the council wanted. What made it worse, in a way that took time to fully register, was that humanity was not being hostile. If they had refused outright, if they had sent warships to escort our delegations away, if they had issued any kind of formal rejection, the Council would have understood how to respond. There were protocols for hostility. There were protocols for rejection. There were no protocols, anywhere in our accumulated diplomatic history, for polite, cheerful, endless delay. Human trade continued throughout this period, and this was perhaps the detail that unsettled the Council most of all. Human vessels moved through neutral space, conducted business with independent stations, and even negotiated small-scale agreements directly with individual Council member species, all without any reference to the larger treaty still sitting unanswered on some desk on Earth. It was as though the grand diplomatic relationship the Council considered essential simply did not factor into humanity's daily operations at all. I recall a moment, several months into this strange standoff, when I was assigned to observe a cultural exchange event hosted by the human station. It was informal, almost festive, filled with music and food from a dozen different Earth regions, and dozens of human diplomats mingled easily with representatives from Council member species who had come out of simple curiosity rather than official duty. I found myself standing near Daniel Hart again, this time in a much less formal setting. He was laughing at something a Kethri delegate had said, holding a small glass of something amber-colored, looking entirely at ease. When he noticed me watching, he waved me over with the same easy friendliness he had shown during that first disastrous meeting. I asked him, as diplomatically as I could manage, why humanity seemed so willing to engage culturally while remaining so resistant to engaging politically. He considered the question for a moment, longer than I expected, and then said something that stayed with me for the rest of my career. He said that people were always worth getting to know, but that agreements were a different matter entirely, and that his government preferred to take its time with anything that could not be easily undone. He said it without any apparent malice, without any strategic calculation, simply as a statement of fact about how his people preferred to operate. I reported this exchange back to Ambassador Tesk, who dismissed it as a low-level diplomat expressing a personal opinion rather than official policy. I was not so certain. There was something in the way Daniel Hart had spoken, something unhurried and entirely unbothered by the pressure our delegations had been applying for months, that suggested he was not simply repeating a talking point. He believed what he was saying, and more troubling still, he seemed to assume that everyone around him already understood it. The council's frustration deepened as the months wore on, and with frustration came something new, something none of us had anticipated when this entire process began. Other member species started paying very close attention to what was happening. I first noticed it during a routine session on tribute quotas, a topic so mundane it rarely drew more than polite attention from the assembled delegates. A representative from one of the smaller member worlds, a species called the Osmi who had joined the council nearly 2 centuries earlier, raised a question that had nothing to do with the agenda item on the floor. She asked, quite simply, why her people continued to pay quarterly resource tributes to the council when a newer, more powerful species was apparently under no such obligation. Orena Doss handled the question smoothly, explaining that humanity had not yet formally joined the council and therefore was not bound by its resource-sharing agreements. But I watched the Osmi representative's expression as she received this answer, and I recognized something in it that I had not expected to see directed at the council itself. Skepticism. It was a small moment, easily overlooked by anyone not paying close attention, but it was the first crack in a foundation that had held steady for longer than most species could remember, and I do not think anyone in that chamber, myself included, fully understood yet how wide that crack would eventually grow. The crack the Osmi representative opened that day did not close. Instead, it spread, slowly at first, then with a speed that caught even the most experienced members of the council off guard. It began with small requests. A handful of member species, mostly smaller worlds with limited industrial capacity, submitted formal inquiries asking whether their resource tribute schedules could be reviewed, given what they described as changing galactic circumstances. The language was careful, almost apologetic, the kind of phrasing diplomats use when they are testing whether a question will be treated as reasonable or as an act of quiet rebellion. Orena Doss addressed each inquiry individually at first, reassuring member worlds that the tribute system remained stable and that humanity's unusual position outside the council changed nothing about existing obligations. I did not believe her, and I do not think she entirely believed herself. I spent a great deal of time during this period reviewing internal council communications as part of my translation duties, and I began to notice a pattern that troubled me deeply. The inquiries were not coming only from smaller worlds anymore. Mid-tier member species, ones with established fleets and stable economies, began raising similar questions, though usually through indirect channels rather than formal petitions. A trade attaché from the Kethri quietly asked one of my colleagues whether the Defense Pact obligations could be renegotiated. A junior minister from the Threlvane delegation mentioned, almost in passing during an unrelated meeting, that his government was reviewing its own resource contribution schedule internally. None of these were formal challenges to council authority. Not yet. But they were something the council had never truly faced before. A quiet, distributed questioning of the assumptions that held the entire structure together. I want to explain why this frightened the council so much, because on the surface it might seem like a minor administrative concern. The council's power was never built on military force, not primarily. Certainly it maintained defense fleets, and certainly those fleets were formidable. But the true foundation of council authority was something less visible and far more fragile. It was belief. Every member species believed, on some fundamental level, that participation in the council was not truly optional, that the benefits of membership so thoroughly outweighed the costs that no rational civilization would choose to exist outside it. Tribute was paid, defense obligations were honored, and council rulings were respected, all because everyone involved accepted a shared premise, that this was simply how galactic civilization worked. Humanity's continued existence outside the Council, thriving, trading, and defending itself without ever formally joining, threatened that premise in a way nothing else ever had. If humans could exist perfectly well without paying tribute, without submitting to arbitration, without deferring to Council rulings on trade disputes, then the obvious question followed for every other species watching: why couldn't they? Orena Das called an emergency closed session roughly 10 months after the original treaty package had gone unanswered. I was not invited as a full participant, but I was assigned to the translation team monitoring the proceedings, which gave me access to nearly everything discussed. It remains, to this day, the most tense meeting I have ever witnessed. The session began with a full briefing on the current state of relations with Earth. The briefing was, to put it simply, discouraging. 7 separate delegations had been sent over the preceding year. Each had returned with variations of the same result: polite engagement on cultural and limited trade matters, combined with an almost total absence of movement on the formal treaty question. Human officials continued to say they were reviewing the proposal. Human officials continued to decline providing any firm timeline. And human trade activity continued to expand across the galaxy without any apparent concern for Council oversight. A representative from the Vantis delegation, a species known for their blunt speaking style even in formal settings, stood and asked a question that I believe every delegate in that chamber had been quietly considering for months. He asked whether the Council's continued insistence on formal treaty negotiation was, in fact, actively damaging Council authority more than simply accepting the current arrangement and moving forward without a formal agreement. The chamber erupted into argument almost immediately, which was itself unusual. Council sessions were governed by strict procedural rules, and open argument of this kind was rare, typically reserved for only the most contentious disputes between hostile member species. But this was different. This was not a dispute between 2 factions. This was the entire Council, collectively, confronting the possibility that its core assumptions about power and legitimacy might no longer hold. Orena Das eventually restored order, though it took considerably longer than usual. She acknowledged, with what I recognized as genuine difficulty, that the Council's traditional approach had not produced results. She proposed a new strategy, one that departed from centuries of established diplomatic practice. Rather than continuing to send formal delegations demanding treaty progress, the Council would instead attempt something closer to informal, individual engagement, sending a small number of representatives to spend extended time among humans, building relationships and understanding rather than pressing for immediate agreement. I did not expect to be chosen for this assignment. I was, at the time, a mid-level translator with a solid but unremarkable career, someone respected for careful work rather than bold initiative. But Orena Das called me into her private office 2 days after the emergency session, and I remember her expression clearly, tired in a way I had never seen from her before, the accumulated weight of 10 months of failed strategy visible in the lines around her eyes. She told me that my earlier report on the conversation with Daniel Hart during the cultural exchange had stayed with her longer than she expected. She said that most of her senior diplomats approached humans the way they approached every other species, treating the relationship as a puzzle to be solved through the correct combination of pressure and incentive. She said she was no longer certain that approach would ever work, and that she needed someone willing to actually listen, rather than someone determined to persuade. I accepted the assignment, though I remember feeling a mixture of pride and genuine fear as I did. Pride because it was, without question, the most significant responsibility of my career. Fear because I understood, even then, that I was being sent to solve a problem that 10 months of the Council's most experienced diplomats had failed to even properly understand. My preparation for the assignment was unlike anything in my previous training. Rather than reviewing treaty language and negotiation tactics, I spent weeks studying human history in far greater depth than my earlier work had required. I read about their wars, which were numerous and often devastating, but I also read about the long periods between those wars, the slow accumulation of cooperation, science, and shared achievement that seemed to happen almost despite humanity's tendency toward internal conflict, rather than because of any external authority forcing them toward it. I began to notice something in these histories that I had not expected. Humanity's relationship with authority itself seemed fundamentally different from every other species I had studied. Where most civilizations, including my own, tended to build stable hierarchies and defer to established structures once those structures proved reasonably functional, human history was full of examples of populations questioning, challenging, and eventually restructuring even long-standing systems of authority when they no longer served the people living under them. I mentioned this observation to Dessa, the young Threlvane linguist who had first confirmed the meaning of humanity's original 5-word response during one of our preparation sessions. She considered it carefully before responding, and what she said has remained with me ever since. She said that perhaps the council had been asking the wrong question all along. We had spent 10 months asking why humanity would not commit to our structure. Perhaps the more useful question was whether our structure had ever actually earned that commitment from anyone, or whether every other species had simply never felt free enough to ask. I did not have an answer for her that day. I am not certain I have a complete answer even now, but that conversation shaped everything that followed during my time among the humans, and it is, I believe, the true beginning of everything I am about to describe. My departure for the human station was arranged quietly, without the ceremony that had accompanied every previous council delegation. I traveled with a small support staff, minimal formal credentials, and instructions that were, for the first time in my career, refreshingly simple. Listen, learn, report honestly, whatever that honesty revealed. I did not know, as my transport approached the station where Daniel Hart had once shrugged in front of an entire council delegation, that I was about to spend the most important months of my life among a people who would fundamentally change how I understood power, legitimacy, and the true cost of demanding loyalty from those who had never truly chosen to give it. The human station was nothing like the council chambers I had spent my career working within, where our facilities favored tall, symmetrical architecture designed to inspire a sense of order and permanence. The human station felt improvised in the most fascinating way. Sections added over time as needs changed, corridors that curved unexpectedly, common areas that seemed designed for conversation rather than ceremony. I remember standing in the main arrival bay during my first hour aboard, watching people move past each other with a kind of casual purpose that felt entirely foreign after a career spent among the council's careful, measured formality. Daniel Hart met me personally, which surprised me given his relatively modest official rank. He greeted me with the same easy manner I remembered from our first meeting, though there was something more attentive in his expression this time, as if he understood that my presence there represented something different from the delegations that had come before. He asked, almost immediately, why the council had sent someone so junior for what he assumed was another attempt at treaty negotiation. I told him honestly that I had not come to negotiate anything. I had come to understand. He studied me for a long moment before smiling, and I remember thinking, even then, that it was the first genuine smile I had received from a human official in the entire 10 months of failed diplomacy that preceded my arrival. My first weeks aboard the station were spent largely in observation. I attended public meetings, sat in on trade negotiations between human companies and independent traders, and spent long hours in the station's common areas simply listening to conversations that had nothing to do with the council at all. I began to notice patterns that no formal briefing document had prepared me for. Humans argued constantly, but their arguments rarely seemed to threaten the underlying relationships between the people involved. I watched 2 station administrators disagree sharply over a resource allocation decision during a public meeting, their voices raised, their positions clearly opposed, only to see them share a meal together that same evening, laughing about something entirely unrelated. This was almost unimaginable within council culture, where disagreement, even mild disagreement, was typically handled through careful, indirect channels specifically designed to avoid open conflict. I asked Daniel Hart about this during one of our regular conversations, which had become something closer to genuine friendship over the weeks I had spent aboard the station. He explained, in the unhurried way I had come to recognize as characteristic of him, that humans generally believed disagreement was not dangerous as long as people remained honest with each other about what they actually wanted. He said that the Council's diplomatic style, with its careful ceremony and indirect phrasing, struck most humans as exhausting at best and dishonest at worst, because it seemed designed to avoid ever clearly stating what anyone actually believed. This observation stayed with me, and I began to see evidence of it everywhere I looked. The Council's treaty language, which I had once considered a masterwork of careful diplomatic construction, suddenly appeared different to me, layered with qualifications and formal phrasing that obscured, rather than clarified, the actual obligations being requested. I began to understand, slowly and with growing discomfort, why humanity's response to that language had been such prolonged, careful silence, rather than either acceptance or outright rejection. They were not stalling. They were genuinely trying to determine what the document actually meant beneath its ceremonial surface, and finding that task more difficult than any straightforward negotiation should require. I spent an afternoon several weeks into my stay with a woman named Laura Bennett, a policy researcher who worked closely with Daniel Hart's office and who had been assigned to help me understand the internal human discussions surrounding the Council Treaty. She was direct in a way that initially startled me, answering questions without the careful hedging I had come to expect from diplomatic conversation. She told me that the primary objection within human government circles was not to any specific clause within the treaty, but to its underlying structure. The treaty, as written, established the Council as the final arbiter in any dispute between member species, including disputes involving trade, territory, and defense obligations. Humanity's own history, she explained, was full of examples where centralized authorities claiming final arbitration over disputes between unequal parties had, over time, come to favor the interests of the powerful over the interests of everyone else, regardless of the careful language used to establish that authority in the first place. I asked her whether this meant humanity considered the Council itself untrustworthy. She considered the question carefully before answering, and her response was more nuanced than I expected. She said it was not a matter of trust in any individual council member, many of whom she believed were acting in good faith. It was a matter of structure, systems that concentrated final authority in a single body, she explained, tended to produce problems over time, regardless of the intentions of the people currently running them, because circumstances changed, leadership changed, and the incentives that shaped decision-making changed along with them. Humanity's own history was full of institutions that had begun with admirable intentions and slowly drifted towards serving narrower interests as time passed. I found myself, during this conversation, defending the Council's structure with more energy than I expected, listing the protections built into treaty language, the review processes, the appeals mechanisms available to member species who felt their interests had been unfairly treated. Laura Bennett listened patiently, then asked a single question that I have not been able to fully answer since. She asked how many member species had ever successfully used those appeals mechanisms to overturn a council ruling that favored a more powerful member species over a weaker one. I did not know the answer. I promised to find out, and when I eventually did, several weeks later, using access to council records that my position afforded me, the number was smaller than I had ever imagined it could be. This was, I believe, the moment my understanding of the entire situation began to genuinely shift. I had arrived at the human station believing my task was to help humanity understand the Council. I began to realize, with growing unease, that perhaps my more urgent task was to help the Council understand humanity, and that doing so honestly would require confronting uncomfortable truths about the institution I had served my entire career. I continued my observations over the following weeks, spending time not only with official representatives like Daniel Hart and Laura Bennett, but with ordinary station residents, traders, engineers, families who had relocated for work, students studying alongside representatives from other species who had chosen to visit the station out of simple curiosity. I attended a gathering hosted by a station engineer named Ryan Castellan, who had invited a small group of colleagues, human and otherwise, to celebrate the completion of a difficult repair project. I remember sitting in his modest quarters, surrounded by people from at least 4 different species, listening to easy conversation and laughter that had nothing to do with treaties, tribute schedules, or council authority. At one point during the evening, Ryan asked me directly what I thought of humanity so far. I answered honestly, telling him I found the openness of human conversation both refreshing and occasionally disorienting, that I had spent my career among species who valued careful indirection, and that the directness I encountered aboard the station had required real adjustment on my part. He laughed, not unkindly, and said something I have thought about often since. He said that humans had spent a very long time fighting among themselves before they finally learned, mostly through hard experience, that honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, tended to prevent far more damage over time than polite avoidance ever could. He said the council's diplomatic style reminded him of an old human phrase, something about kicking a problem further down a road rather than actually solving it, and that most humans he knew found that approach frustrating rather than reassuring. I asked him, somewhat hesitantly, whether he believed humanity would ever join the council at all. He considered the question seriously before answering, which I appreciated, because I had grown tired of receiving either dismissive shrugs or carefully rehearsed political language whenever I raised the subject with more senior officials. He said he did not know, and that he suspected most humans did not know either, because the decision was still genuinely being debated across human society, rather than settled quietly by a small group of officials. He said that was, in his view, exactly how such a significant decision should be made, even if it frustrated outside observers who wanted a quick and clear answer. I began drafting my reports back to Orena Doss during this period, and I found myself facing a difficulty I had not anticipated when I accepted this assignment. My instructions had been to report honestly, whatever that honesty revealed, but the more time I spent among humans, the more I understood that an honest report would not simply describe humanity's reasons for delay. It would require questioning the very foundations of the institution that had sent me there in the first place. I remember sitting alone in my quarters late one evening, staring at an unfinished report on my screen, genuinely uncertain how to proceed. I had joined the Council's diplomatic service because I believed, with real conviction, that the structure it maintained produced stability, fairness, and mutual benefit across an enormous and diverse galaxy. I had spent my entire adult life operating within that belief, and now I found myself gathering evidence that suggested the structure I had trusted so completely might be built on assumptions that had never been properly tested, because no species powerful enough to test them had ever tried, until humanity arrived and simply declined to participate in a system it had never actually agreed to join. I thought often, during those difficult weeks of writing and rewriting, about something Dessa had said to me before I left for the human station. Perhaps the council had been asking the wrong question all along. I was beginning to suspect she was right, and I was beginning to understand that my next report would need to say so, regardless of how that honesty might be received by the institution I had served for my entire career. My return to council territory was quieter than I expected, though I suspect that quiet was deliberate on Orena Doss's part. She had arranged for my full report to be delivered privately, to a small session of senior advisors, before any wider announcement was made to the full council chamber. I understood, even before the meeting began, that she was giving herself room to absorb whatever I brought back before deciding how much of it the rest of the council needed to hear. I stood before that small gathering with a report that had taken me nearly 3 weeks to finalize, revised more times than any document I had produced in my career. I had considered, more than once during those final weeks aboard the human station, whether to soften my conclusions, to frame them in language that would protect the council's authority, while still technically reporting what I had observed. I decided against it. I owed Orena Doss the same honesty she had asked of me when she assigned me this task, even if that honesty was uncomfortable for everyone in the room, myself included. I told them, plainly, that humanity was not delaying the treaty as a negotiating tactic. I told them that humanity's hesitation came from a genuine, carefully considered concern about the structure of the Council itself, a belief, based on their own difficult history, that any system granting final authority to a single body over disputes between unequal parties would eventually begin favoring the powerful over the weak, regardless of the good intentions of whoever currently held that authority. I told them what Laura Bennett had asked me, about how many member species had ever successfully overturned a council ruling that favored a more powerful species over a weaker one. I gave them the number I had found in the council's own records, and I watched several of the senior advisors in that room shift uncomfortably as I did. And then I told them the part I knew would be hardest to hear. I told them that humanity did not need to be forced to the table, because humanity had never truly needed the Council in the way every previous member species had. They traded on their own terms, defended themselves without assistance, and continued to grow without any structural advantage the Council could offer that they could not eventually build for themselves. The only thing that might ever bring them to a genuine agreement, I said, was a structure that did not ask them to surrender final authority over their own future to a body they had not helped design. The silence that followed my report was different from the silence that had followed humanity's original 5-word response all those months earlier. That earlier silence had been confusion, the sound of an institution encountering something it could not immediately categorize. This silence was heavier. It was the sound of people beginning to understand something they did not want to understand, and searching, quietly and individually, for a way to avoid the full weight of what it meant. Orena Doss was the first to speak, and I remember her question clearly, because it revealed more about her own uncertainty than any statement could have. She asked me whether I believed the Council's structure could actually be changed, given how many generations of established precedent and treaty language stood behind it. I told her honestly that I did not know, but that I believed the question itself, whether the structure could change, was less important than a different question, whether the structure would survive if it refused to. I do not know exactly what happened in the discussions that followed my report, because I was not present for most of them. What I do know is what unfolded across the following months, and I watched it unfold with a strange mixture of pride and unease, aware that my own words had played some part in setting these events into motion. The first sign of change came quietly, almost invisibly to anyone not paying close attention. A handful of smaller member species, the same ones who had begun raising quiet questions about tribute schedules months earlier, submitted formal requests for a full review of the Council's arbitration procedures. This had happened before, occasionally, over the Council's long history, but always as isolated incidents, easily managed and quickly forgotten. This time, the requests arrived together, coordinated in a way that suggested private conversations had been happening between member species long before any formal petition reached the Council floor. Orena Doss, to her credit, did not dismiss these requests the way I suspect her predecessors might have. She convened a formal review committee, and I was asked to join it, given my direct experience with the human situation that had, in many ways, started this entire chain of events. The committee's work was slow and often contentious, filled with disagreements between member species who had very different ideas about what fairness within the Council's structure should actually look like. But it was work, real work, aimed at genuinely reconsidering assumptions that had gone unchallenged for longer than most species involved could remember. Not every reaction was positive. Some senior council members, particularly those from species who had benefited significantly from the existing structure, resisted the review process at every turn. I remember a particularly difficult session where a delegate from one of the Council's founding species argued forcefully that any weakening of centralized authority would invite chaos, that the very stability the Council provided depended on member species accepting its final judgment without constant renegotiation. I understood his concern, even sympathized with parts of it. Stability was not without value, but I had spent enough time among humans by that point to recognize the difference between stability that came from genuine trust and stability that came from an absence of any real alternative. Meanwhile, something else was happening outside the formal council chambers, something that I believe ultimately shaped the outcome of this entire situation more than any committee review ever could. Individual member species, frustrated by the slow pace of formal reform, began quietly approaching humanity directly, seeking bilateral agreements that did not require passing through the Council's traditional treaty process at all. I learned of the first such agreement almost by accident, during a conversation with Dessa, who had remained in close contact with me since my return. She told me that the Kethri, one of the Council's older and more influential member species, had reached a limited trade agreement directly with human representatives, covering a narrow set of resource exchanges in a shared border region. The agreement was small in scope, carefully limited, but its significance went far beyond its actual terms. It was proof, visible to every other species watching, that meaningful cooperation with humanity was possible without routing that cooperation through the Council's traditional structure. More agreements followed. Some were modest, limited trade arrangements between individual species and specific human companies or regional governments. Others were more ambitious, joint research projects, shared defense coordination in contested border systems, cultural exchange programs that operated entirely outside Council oversight. Each agreement, on its own, might have seemed like a minor development. Together, they represented something the Council had never faced before in its long history, a growing web of relationships that existed entirely independent of its authority. I found myself, during this period, in an unusual position. I was too closely associated with the human situation to be considered fully neutral by Council traditionalists, who viewed my report as having contributed directly to the instability now spreading through the organization. But I was also viewed with genuine respect by the reform-minded delegates who saw my honesty as having finally forced a conversation the Council should have had generations earlier. I moved between these two camps carefully, trying to remain useful to both, though I suspect, in the end, neither side fully trusted me the way they once might have trusted a diplomat who had simply told them what they wanted to hear. Orena Das called me into her office one final time, nearly a year after my return from the human station. She looked older than I remembered, though I understood by then that the changes I saw in her were less about the passage of time and more about the weight of decisions she had been forced to make. She told me that the Reform Committee's work would continue, though its final outcome remained genuinely uncertain, with some member species pushing for sweeping changes to arbitration procedures and others resisting even modest reforms. She asked me, near the end of our conversation, whether I regretted the honesty of my original report, given everything that had followed. I considered the question carefully before answering, because I owed her a genuine answer, not a comfortable one. I told her I did not regret it, though I understood why some within the Council might wish I had softened my conclusions. I told her that the instability we were now experiencing was, in my view, not something my report had created. It was something my report had simply revealed, an instability that had existed within the Council's structure for a very long time, hidden by the fact that no species powerful enough to test it had ever chosen to do so, until humanity arrived and through nothing more dramatic than patient, polite refusal, exposed a weakness that had been there all along. I think often about my time aboard the human station, particularly about a conversation I had with Laura Bennett during my final days there. I had asked her, somewhat directly, whether she believed humanity would eventually join the Council in some form, even a reformed one. She told me she believed it was possible, but only if the Council became something genuinely worth joining, rather than something humanity simply felt pressured into accepting. She said that humans generally responded well to fairness, to structures they had a real hand in shaping, but responded very poorly to demands for loyalty that were not matched by any meaningful voice in how that loyalty would be used. She said the Council's greatest mistake, in her view, was assuming that humanity's silence in those early months represented uncertainty about whether to join, when it had actually represented uncertainty about whether the Council, as it currently existed, deserved to be joined at all. I do not know, even now, how this story ultimately ends. The Reform Committee continues its slow, difficult work. New bilateral agreements between individual species and humanity continue to emerge, some successful, some abandoned, after failing to produce the results either side hoped for. Some council members remain convinced that these developments represent a temporary crisis that will eventually resolve itself once humanity finally, inevitably, accepts the necessity of joining a structure that has governed galactic civilization for longer than their entire recorded history. Others, myself increasingly among them, suspect that the Council itself will need to change more fundamentally than any of its founding species ever imagined, if it hopes to remain relevant in a galaxy where the newest, most powerful civilization to arrive has quietly demonstrated that participation, however beneficial, must ultimately be chosen rather than assumed. I think back often to that first alarm in the chamber, the quiet, precise sound that meant something had broken that was never supposed to break. I understand now that what actually broke that day was not any specific agreement or timeline. It was an assumption, one so deeply embedded in council culture that almost no one had ever thought to question it. The assumption that power, once established, simply continues, that authority, once accepted by enough species over enough generations, becomes permanent, regardless of whether it continues to earn the trust it depends upon. I do not know whether history will eventually remember me as someone who helped weaken an institution that had provided real stability across a vast and diverse galaxy for longer than any single species could claim credit for. I do not know whether it will instead remember me as the first diplomat in council history, honest enough to admit that an institution built entirely on the assumption of universal participation was never actually prepared for a species confident enough to simply decline. What I do know is this. I sat in that chamber the day humanity's silence first arrived, watching an institution built on absolute certainty confront, for the first time in its long history, genuine doubt. And whatever comes next, whatever shape the Council eventually takes, whatever role humanity ultimately chooses to play within or beside it, I will always remember that moment as the beginning of something neither side fully understood yet, something that felt, even then, less like an ending and more like the first honest conversation this galaxy had ever truly had.